A midnight breeze crosses a flat floodplain and meets almost no resistance, as if the land has learned how to stay quiet. The air carries the faint taste of dust and far-off water. Somewhere beyond the edge of sight, a river bends in the dark, and the wind follows its curve like a memory. Beneath this plain, beneath a thin skin of sand and silt, brick lines sleep. Not the scattered rubble of a single fallen wall, but long, deliberate rows. Streets so straight they feel less like accidents of growth, and more like a decision held steady for generations. If you could brush the earth aside with the gentleness of a hand across cloth, you might feel the corners first. Clean angles, careful joins, small signs that someone once cared enough to make a city behave like an idea. This story begins in the land once called Sindhu, the country of the Indus and its many waters. It's easy to imagine a civilization rising along one river, as if history prefers a single line you can trace with a finger. But the Indus world belonged to more than one ribbon of water. It grew within a wider landscape, rivers that held their course through the year, seasonal streams that arrived and withdrew, wells cut into the ground, and the slow truth of rainfall. Water came in different moods and on different schedules. The people learned to listen, because listening was survival, and later something like wisdom. What we know of them comes mostly without voices. We meet them through archaeology, through what the ground keeps when language is gone, bricks laid into foundations, streets worn by feet and carts, tools shaped to fit the palm, pottery that once carried water, grain, oil, milk, charred seeds that hint at meals and seasons, bones that hint at herding and hunting, and the long partnership between humans and animals, and again small seals carved with animals and tiny signs made to press identity into clay. There is one great limit that shapes everything we can say. The Indus script survives, but only in brief inscriptions, short sequences of signs on seals and small objects. Despite generations of study, it remains unread, so the names are mostly silent. The stories do not arrive intact. The rulers, if there were rulers in the way we expect, do not step forward with titles we can pronounce. We do not open a royal archive. We do not hear a priest's words recorded for us. We stand instead before a civilization that left many traces, yet withheld the kind of written narration other ancient worlds offer more freely. And still, there is something we can sense with confidence. What rises from the evidence is a civilization of coordination. Shared standards are repeated over great distances. Careful planning, not once, but again and again, until maintenance itself feels like part of the culture. A dense life of making, hands shaping clay, drilling stone, polishing shell, working metal, mending what must be mended. From the fragments we can touch, the Indus world feels less like a single dramatic moment and more like a long habit, an agreement renewed each day between neighbours, streets, and water. Much else remains partly out of reach, and so we move gently around it. We don't force certainty where the ground has not given it. We allow the silence to stay in the room with us. Tonight's journey is not an attempt to make the Indus speak in sentences it never left behind. It is an attempt to listen to a city the way you listen to the sea at night, not for words, but for pattern and presence, for the rhythm of systems, for the shape of ordinary life, for the calm intelligence of people who built not only for themselves, but for the strangers who would share their streets tomorrow. Before we go deeper, please tell me, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? I'd love to check comment. Imagine, for a moment, a late-night water carrier. Not a hero in a grand story, not a name carved into stone, just a person moving through a sleeping neighbourhood. The air has cooled. Underfoot, the bricks still hold a little of the day's warmth. Somewhere a dog shifts and settles again. Somewhere a door is latched from the inside. The water carrier reaches a well, brick-lined, familiar as a repeated gesture, and pauses. The rope creaks as it slides over the edge. The bucket drops into darkness. There is a moment of waiting, and then the soft sound of contact. The small kiss of water. Simple, but precise. In dry times, it comes later. In generous times, it comes quickly, as if the earth is offering what it has without hesitation. The carrier listens and knows. This is how much of the Indus world reaches us, through quiet actions we have to imagine from silent evidence. And among that evidence, one object returns again and again. A carved stamp seal, pressed into wet clay, leaving behind a clean impression. It's a tool built to carry identity without a spoken voice, not a story told aloud, but a small certainty made physical. Just a mark, firm and repeatable, saying, "This belongs, this travelled, this was counted, this was known." So before we go deeper, before streets rise from soil and cities learn to breathe, let one quiet question rest in the mind, as gently as a seal resting in a palm. If you could press one mark into wet clay to represent your whole life, what would you choose to leave behind? Dawn fog lies low along the edge of a village, and the world feels unfinished in the gentle light. The air is cool enough that a breath briefly shows itself, then vanishes, as if it never meant to be seen. Under a thin skin of ash, a hearth still holds the night's warmth. Not flame anymore, just a steady ember glow, the quiet endurance of yesterday's fire. Near the wall, a clay jar sits with its rounded weight of grain. Plain, unpainted, practical, and precious in the simplest way. It holds time. It holds the year as a promise no one needs to speak aloud. If we follow the Indus world backward, before straight streets, before covered drains, before seals pressed into clay, we do not fall into emptiness. We step into something older and steadier, the slow making of habit. The kind of habit that does not feel like invention when you live it, only like life. And yet, for centuries, it becomes the foundation for everything that comes after. Long before the great cities, communities across this wider region learned to work with soil and animals. Farming and herding are not single breakthroughs, they are long relationships. Fields ask for patience, for timing, for faith in a future you cannot yet see. Herds ask for attention through heat and cold, through illness, through the hard weeks when fodder runs low. Over many generations, these practices turn into rhythms, seasonal, familiar, quietly binding. A harvest is not one triumphant day. It is the same set of choices repeated again and again, until those choices begin to shape how people understand time itself. One of the places where this early village world becomes visible is Mehrgarh, among other sites. There, the ground has kept a long record, traces of food production, craft work and burial across centuries. Not a single frozen scene, but layers, one life built upon another, like sediment settling patiently in a basin. In those layers you can almost feel continuity, a footprint pressed into the same earth where another generation will later stand, not knowing they are standing in a line of lives. And even when we speak in broad spans, the life itself remains intimate. You can picture a village waking by small sounds. A goat shifts, hooves scraping dry ground. A child stirs and is hushed with a hand that knows the shape of that child's hair in the dark. Someone steps outside and pauses, not to consult anything written, but to read the morning the way the body reads it, by the bite in the air, the smell of damp soil, the direction of wind. Fog will lift when it is ready. The sun will rise without announcement. Work will begin as it always does, not as ceremony, but as routine. Over time, the practices that make settled life possible grow more refined. Storage becomes more dependable. Tools become better suited to repeated tasks. People learn slowly how to plan beyond the day in front of them, not with schedules written down, but with shared expectations carried in memory. When to plant, when to move animals to better grazing, when to patch a roof before the next rain, when to set aside grain, not for tomorrow, but for the difficult stretch everyone knows will come. These are not dramatic inventions. They are quiet successes, the kind that rarely look like change until you look back and realize the difference. Because of that, beginnings are best understood as a mosaic, not a spark. There is no single village that becomes the start, no lone genius who suddenly thinks a city into existence. Instead, there are many local traditions, each with its own ways of shaping clay, storing food, burying the dead, arranging kinship, solving disputes. One community learns something useful, another adapts it. A third changes it again. Over generations, the region becomes more connected, not through a single command, but through repeated contact and shared needs. And perhaps the first step toward a city is not a wall or a street. Perhaps it is the moment a place begins to feel worth returning to, season after season, until leaving starts to feel like losing part of yourself. That feeling is hard to measure with archaeology, and yet it leaves traces. A house repaired instead of abandoned. A jar replaced when it cracks. A hearth rebuilt in the same spot because that corner has become the heart of the home. A burial placed carefully, not hurriedly, because the community expects to remain here long enough to remember. In this early world, craft is already present, not as luxury alone, but as skill woven into life. Imagine a beadmaker seated where the morning light is coolest. The work is small enough to vanish in a fist. A stone bead, blank, still rough, not yet polished, rests against a support. The beadmaker holds a bow drill, a simple tool that turns back and forth with a steady pull. There is grit involved, fine abrasive grains that do the cutting slowly and visibly. The hands are practiced. The posture is familiar, the motion is patient. The bow moves, the drill spins, the sound is soft, like a small insect working inside wood. Minutes pass, then more minutes. Nothing happens quickly, but the hole deepens. The bead begins to change from a piece of stone into something made, something meant to be worn, gifted, traded, carried. In that slow turning, you can feel something more than survival. You can feel attention. You can feel the desire to shape the world beyond food and shelter, to carry beauty through ordinary days. And nearby, life continues in parallel rhythms. A pot is set close to the hearth. Someone stirs embers back into flame with a practiced patience, as if the fire itself needs persuasion, rather than force. Water is poured carefully because water is effort, even when it is close. Grain is measured because grain is time. A hand reaches into the jar and feels the level, quietly, without panic, but with a mind that understands what the hand discovers. A family learns winter not by numbers, but by signs that do not lie, by how far the grain sits from the jar's lip, by the sound of animals at night. In the long, dark weeks, goats shift and murmur in their enclosure, and the sound is reassuring, alive, present, part of the household's wealth. If the jar is too low, the sound changes in the mind. It becomes less comforting. Planning begins to take a different shape. A family does not need a calendar to know when it is safe to relax and when it is time to be careful. This is the subtle intelligence of early settled life, the mind trained to notice small signals and to respond before crisis becomes catastrophe. Archaeology also shows that burial practices were part of these communities' worlds. Burials preserve not only bodies, but choices, how a person was placed, what objects were included, what gestures were made for the dead. even without a readable inscription, even without a spoken explanation that care tells us something, plain and profound. Death was not treated as mere disposal. It was treated as an event that required attention, responsibility, and memory. And alongside those burials, alongside the traces of farming and herding, there are crafted objects, small beads, shaped ornaments, worked materials that did not have to exist, and yet exist because someone made time for them. A bead can be evidence of connection, of trade perhaps, of gift-giving, of the simple human desire to hold something made with care and to let it touch the skin. It is a small thing, but small things often travel far, through hands, through marriages, through friendships, through the quiet exchanges that knit communities together. When we hold these pieces together, a picture begins to form, not of a sudden leap, but of a long preparation. Farming teaches planning, herding teaches vigilance, storage teaches patience, tools teach efficiency, craft teaches precision, burials teach continuity, the sense that a community extends beyond the living moment. None of these alone makes a city, but together they create the conditions where a city can someday be imagined without seeming impossible. Because a city is not only buildings, it is agreement, it is trust returned. It is the belief that if you invest today, if you build, store, repair and maintain, others will be here tomorrow to do the same. So when the fog lifts from the village edge, and the hearth is coaxed into fuller flame, and the grain jar sits with its heavy promise, we're not yet in the Indus cities, but we're in the roots of them. We're in the long apprenticeship of settled life, where the most important lessons are learned slowly, by repetition. A child watches an adult measure grain with a hand that does not waste. Another watches a bead take shape under a drill. Someone learns that a home is not made once and finished. It is made again each season, by care. And in that care, invisible rules begin to form, unwritten yet powerful. They live in how food is shared, in how labour is divided, in how disputes are soothed before they become fractures, in what is considered fair, in how a boundary is respected, in what is saved for the future, even when the present is tempting. Because once people stay, once they truly decide to remain, then the ground becomes more than ground. It becomes a record of promises kept or broken. And the village becomes more than shelters. It becomes a place with memory. And that is where the next part of our story waits, quietly, just beyond the fog's edge, where footpaths begin to harden into roots, and roots begin to belong to more than one family. So let one soft question rest with us as we move forward. When a community finally stays in one place, what invisible rules begin to settle into the ground with them? Evening smoke rises from clustered roofs and thins into the dimming sky. The day's heat loosens its hold, and the air becomes gentler to breathe. Somewhere a pot is scraped clean with a small familiar sound. Somewhere a child is called in, not sharply, but with the tired tenderness that comes when light begins to fail. What was once a scattered knot of homes now feels fuller. More voices, more footsteps, more routine. And beyond the last doorway, beyond the last low wall, the ground carries marks that were not always there. Footpaths begin to set, not in a single season, and not because anyone names them. They set the way habits set by repetition. A curve that avoids thorn and stone, a dip where rainwater lingers after a storm, a rise where, for a moment, a traveller can see the line of hills and know the direction without asking. The same feet choose the same line again and again until the earth begins to remember. By the time we reach what archaeologists call the early Harappan period, roughly the centuries before the great urban flowering, settlements across the wider Indus region are changing in scale and in feel. Villages are still villages, but some places grow into towns. People gather in larger numbers, Pottery styles and craft traditions begin to show regional character, distinctive local habits, repeated often enough to become visible across layers of time. And pottery, more than almost anything else, becomes a quiet map. Not a map drawn on parchment, but a map made out of fragments. The curve of a rim, the thickness of a wall, a slip that gives a vessel a particular sheen, the way a pot is fired, too hot, too cool, too uneven, or perfectly controlled. These choices vary from place to place, and over time they spread, fade, or shift. In one layer of floor, a familiar style dominates. In the next, a new preference appears, as if taste itself has moved through the town like a slow wind. People break pots without intending to, and the broken pieces last. In the long view, those sherds become one of the simplest ways the past holds onto its own rhythm. Time made visible in clay. As settlements grow, movement between them grows with it. Stone, shell, and metal begin to travel more regularly and over greater distances. Some of it comes from coasts where shell is gathered and worked, some from uplands and mountains where stone can be quarried, or where certain ores can be found and coaxed into usable metal. None of this happens by accident. It implies knowledge of sources, of routes, of seasons, of which valleys are passable after rain, and which become traps of mud. It implies relationships, someone willing to part with what they have, someone else willing to offer something in return. This is not a world where everyone stays close to home. Distance begins to be bridged, not by conquest, not by empire in the familiar sense, but by repeated journeys and the slow, practical art of cooperation. People who do not share kinship learn little by little how to treat one another as predictable, and predictability as a kind of trust. In this same period, craft becomes more specialized. You begin to see repeated methods and recognizable finishes, the sense that certain hands or certain workshops or certain communities are making particular things often enough that the results become consistent. A bowl shaped in a familiar way, a bead drilled cleanly and evenly, a shell object polished to the same smooth certainty each time. When specialization takes hold, it changes daily life quietly. It means someone is doing a task so often that mistakes become rarer, quality becomes steadier, and expectations become sharper. Because if you trade for something, you want to know what you are getting. You want a vessel that will hold water without seeping. You want a bead that will not crack after a few weeks of wear. You want metal that will not fail the first time it is tested. In the background of all this, without readable writing, without proclamations that tell us how it worked, administrative habits may be taking shape. The evidence is indirect. Repeated standards, repeated routines, repeated ways of making and exchanging. It does not prove a single authority issuing commands across the landscape, but it does suggest coordination beyond the limits of face-to-face familiarity. People are learning to agree on things that strangers can share, how goods are made, how value is judged, how obligations are remembered. And coordination changes imagination. A village is no longer only itself. It becomes one place among others. Here begins to lean toward there. A person can start to think in terms of roots, not just fields, of strangers, not just neighbors, of next season's meeting with someone whose name they may not know, but whose behavior has become familiar enough to rely on. Trust, of course, is never automatic. It is built in small successes, a fair trade, a safe journey completed, a promise kept when it would have been easy to break, a gift returned at the right time. Repetition turns these moments into a working assumption, and once that assumption exists, networks can grow. To feel this era in human terms, imagine a potter at the end of a long day. The potter sits with a lump of clay and tests it between thumb and forefinger. The motion is small, but the attention is complete. The clay speaks through texture. Too smooth, and it may crack in the fire. Too coarse, and it may weaken the vessel. The potter pinches, rolls, presses, feeling for balance the way a musician feels for tuning. Tomorrow's bowls are being chosen now before the kiln is lit, before smoke has any reason to rise. The hands know what the household needs: storage jars for grain, sturdy cooking pots for heat, smaller bowls for daily meals, and then, now and then, the hands do something slightly different. A finer curve, a smoother finish, a touch of extra care. Not for survival exactly, but for exchange. For the moment when the object will leave the familiar circle of the village and travel outward into the wider web. The potter is not only making a vessel, the potter is participating in a system, one that links hearths to roads, families to strangers, local clay to distant demand. And beyond the village, along those Harding routes, imagine another figure. A caravan guide pauses at a stopping point and tastes the water. A small sip. A brief evaluation. Yet the gesture carries weight. The guide reads water the way others read clouds. Is it fresh enough to drink? Is there enough for the animals? Does the taste hint at a source that might fail soon? The guide does not announce anything dramatically. Decisions like this are rarely dramatic when you must make them often. The group will sleep here under open sky, or push onward into darkness toward the next known place. Quiet choices that determine whether a journey remains merely difficult or becomes dangerous. And the caravan carries more than goods. It carries information, news of what has become scarce, what has become abundant, what kinds of objects people seem to want this year, what routes feel safer, what stopping points are drying out. It carries styles too, new ways of shaping a pot, tying a bundle, decorating a bead. In this way, networks are not only economic, they are cultural, they thicken the world. For archaeologists, one of the clearest signs of that thickening is humble. Pottery sherds in layered floors, a broken rim here, a different surface treatment there, a subtle change in firing technique. Each difference can be small enough to overlook in isolation, but arranged through layers, one floor built upon another, they become a record of time passing, a slow heartbeat in clay. A pot is made, used, broken, swept aside. The floor is repaired, another pot takes its place, another break, another layer. Centuries later, someone excavates carefully and finds, not the sound of the old village, but its rhythm, the certainty that life moved through this space day after day, season after season. And through that life, something begins to shift. The world becomes more connected. People begin to rely not only on what their own hands can produce, but on what others can make and bring. A village becomes less isolated. A town becomes a node. A route becomes a thread tying many lives together. No one wakes one morning and declares, "Now we're entering a new era." The change arrives the way evening arrives, quietly, almost politely, until you look up and realize the light has altered. And as routes grow more familiar, as towns take shape, as craft becomes steadier and exchange more regular, the next step approaches. Not a sudden leap, but a gradual swelling toward the first true cities, places where coordination will be written into streets and water will be given a nearer place in daily life. So let the question at the edge of this chapter remain soft, like the last light fading from rooftops. How does a path turn into a road, without anyone ever announcing that it has begun? Night settles onto a street that seems almost too straight to be accidental. Baked brick holds the day's warmth in its body and gives it back slowly, like a quiet kindness. Above, the sky feels wide and patient, stars steady enough to look arranged, though of course they are not. Underfoot, the ground is made for weight, for feet, for carts, for the long seasonal moods that arrive with rain. Even in darkness, the street keeps its discipline. It does not meander, it does not hesitate. It moves forward with the calm confidence of something built to last. In the older world, paths hardened into routes, and routes became roads without anyone declaring a new beginning. Now the road crosses an invisible threshold. It enters the city. By around 2600 BCE, the Indus world has grown into something astonishingly large and remarkably coordinated. Big urban centres, Harappa and Mohenjo-daro most famously, stand among a vast scatter of towns and villages spread across an enormous region. This is not a single capital commanding a few dependent outposts. It is a broad landscape of settlements, different in size and role, yet linked by shared habits of making and building. If you imagine the city at night, you don't feel loud grandeur. You feel something quieter, a steadiness, a sense that daily life has been arranged so it can go on, again and again, without breaking. Because a city is not only the number of people it holds, a city is repetition. It is a culture deciding, generation after generation, that certain things will be done in a dependable way. In the Indus world, you can see that decision in the simplest material of all, brick. Across many sites, familiar features return with almost stubborn consistency. Streets laid out with intention, bricks made to shared proportions, wells appearing again and again, and drainage systems built not as improvised ditches, but as planned arteries. Many drains are covered, discreet, almost modest in their engineering, as if the city is quietly insisting that waste belongs out of sight and away from where people live. Stand still in the imagined dark and you can sense the priorities without anyone telling you. Water is kept close. Waste is guided away. Movement is made predictable. The city does not demand that every household solve these problems alone. It builds answers into the ground and then expects those answers to be used. That expectation reaches beyond streets and drains. Across distance, archaeologists find signs of shared standards, especially in building conventions and later in weights and measures, suggesting broad coordination. It does not require us to imagine a single ruler issuing orders across thousands of miles. Shared standards can also grow from long practice. Merchants who need agreement, builders who rely on familiar proportions, craftspeople trained in inherited methods, communities that come to prefer what works and keep doing it. Whatever the mechanism, the effect is real. Mason arriving in a new city would not feel lost in the materials. The bricks would be familiar in the hand. A trader would not be guessing at every exchange. A household planning repairs would not be inventing a solution from scratch. Shared standards reduce friction in a world full of strangers. They allow a city to breathe without constant argument. And yet, when you look for the usual theatrical signs of ancient power, palaces rising above neighborhoods, royal tombs announcing lineage, monumental statues of kings, inscriptions boasting of conquest, the Indus world does not present them with the same clarity seen elsewhere. That absence has long shaped how scholars debate Indus politics. Authority may have existed in forms that leave fewer obvious monuments. Power may have been distributed differently, through civic bodies, influential merchant networks, local councils, or institutions we cannot easily name. Some symbols of authority may have been made in wood or cloth, performed in rituals, spoken and remembered rather than carved in stone. The ground gives us planning, maintenance, standardization, cooperation. It does not give us a clear throne, so the city becomes its own statement. Not a shout, but something closer to a long, calm line of thought, written not in proclamations, but in decisions repeated until they became normal. To feel the city as lived experience, step forward to a moment after heavy rain. The monsoon has come through with its blunt insistence. Water has rushed along the streets. pressed against walls, filled low places and courtyards. And now the sky clears. The air smells of wet earth and warmed brick. Light returns slowly, making puddles shine like pieces of broken sky. This is when a different kind of work begins. A maintenance worker moves through a neighbourhood where the rain has left behind silt, the fine sediment that doesn't look dangerous until it quietly becomes one. The worker stops at a covered drain. The stone cover is heavy. It must be lifted with effort and practiced leverage, the body knowing exactly how much force to apply. Beneath, the channel is dark and damp. Silt has collected there, thickening in places where water slowed. The worker kneels and clears it away, scooping, scraping, restoring flow. No one gathers to watch. No one marks the moment in a monument. But the city depends on this quiet ritual as surely as it depends on harvests. The drain is not an accidental trench. It is engineered, and engineered in a way that assumes continuity. It assumes people will return after the rain. It assumes someone will care. Nearby, another kind of learning happens. A child comes to know the neighbourhood not by maps or measurements, but by sound. In daylight it is corners, doors, familiar faces. In early hours it becomes echoes. The hollow note that lingers near a well, the soft slosh where water rests in a courtyard, the sharper ring of steps on baked brick, the duller hush on packed earth. The child learns where air stays cooler, where walls hold the night longer, where the city is gentler. Without anyone naming it, the city teaches its own infrastructure as a kind of home knowledge. The child grows up with an intimate sense of systems, without ever thinking of them as systems. They're just the background that makes life feel possible. And, under everything, the physical anchors remain. Brick-lined wells and covered drains. The well is a vertical promise, water held close even when rivers shift their temper or seasons tighten. The drain is a horizontal discipline, waste guided away so it does not poison the spaces where people eat, sleep and raise children. Together they form something like an urban ethic that is never stated out loud, yet is written into brick. Keep water accessible, keep the city clean, keep life workable. Because these things are repeated across neighbourhoods, they become expectation, and expectation shapes behaviour. When water is near, washing becomes easier to insist upon. When drainage exists, cleanliness becomes less a luxury and more a norm. When streets are predictable, movement becomes less risky. None of this proves perfect equality, and the subtler forms of hierarchy can be hard to measure at this distance. But it does suggest a city built around the ordinary needs of many, not only the display of a few. In this mature urban world, the city feels like a collective agreement that outlives individuals. People are born into streets that already know their line. They grow up with wells that have served generations. They die, and others still lift the cover stones after rain. It is a vision of civilization that does not require us to know a king's name to recognize its intelligence. It asks us to notice different kinds of greatness, standardization, planning, maintenance, and the quiet willingness to keep returning to the same tasks. And beyond the straight streets and lit doorways, the countryside continues, towns and villages feeding the cities, supplying them, living in the same wider landscape of many waters. The urban centres are not separate from that world. They depend on it, on fields, on herds, on seasonal rhythms, on routes that keep goods and people moving. So the city holds steady, like a thought held steady. And as we prepare to step deeper toward markets and measures toward the social life of fairness, let the last image remain simple. A stone cover lifted, silt cleared away, water moving again. If a city's greatness is measured by what it quietly maintains, what in this world was considered non-negotiable? A small lamp burns in a shop, its flame steady in air that smells faintly of clay dust and warm oil. Outside, the street has gone dim, only the soft scrape of a sandal now and then, the distant cough of a night watchman, a dog settling back into sleep. But inside, the world is close and contained. The light falls onto a low counter and gathers there, as if it has decided to stay. Within that circle sit stone weights in a neat row. They are cubical, plain, unadorned, little blocks of darkness made solid. When the shopkeeper's hand touches one, the stone holds the coolness of the night. It has the quiet heaviness of something meant to be trusted. In the previous chapter, the city showed its greatness through what it maintained. Wells that kept water near, drains that carried waste away, streets that made movement predictable. Now we enter another kind of maintenance, less visible, but just as essential to crowded life, the maintenance of agreement. Across the Indus world, archaeologists have found standardized weights and measures repeated from place to place, as if many communities were leaning on the same shared idea of how exchange should work. The pattern doesn't promise perfect honesty. It doesn't guarantee that every bargain ended fairly, but it suggests something crucial. People wanted a common frame of reference, something firmer than a loud voice, stronger than status, steadier than mood. In a village, memory can carry much of this. Reputation travels quickly when everyone knows everyone else, when a family name is also a record. But a city is different. A city is made of strangers passing at close range. It runs on transactions, small ones, constant ones, the kind that decide whether a household eats well tonight or stretches what it has. In that setting, conflict can become a daily heat, unless there is some way to cool it. A weight is one way. The evidence suggests active marketplaces and organized movement of goods, not only for ornaments and fine craft, but for the staples that make ordinary life possible. Grain and oil, salt and pottery, tools and cloth, things that move through homes with the same quiet necessity as water through a drain. We cannot stand in a single preserved market day and hear the bargaining voices. But the distribution of objects, the patterns of production and storage, the repeated presence of measuring tools, these traces hint at routines of buying and selling that had to be dependable enough to repeat. In that world, measurement becomes a language, a way of saying, this is what I mean, this is what I offer, and you can check me. What exactly that standardization reflects is still debated. It may point in some places to regulation or oversight, an expectation enforced by civic authority or by influential groups. In other places it may reflect merchant custom, the practical agreements that traders adopt because business collapses without them. It may also be something quieter than either, conventions so normal that no one speaks of them as rules at all. The Indus world was wide and varied, and a pattern that looks unified in our hands may have been held together by many local pressures. But whatever the mechanism, the intent is visible in the objects themselves. These weights were made to be used and to be recognized. And standardization did not stop at the counter. It appears in brick sizes, in certain shared conventions of craft, in repeated forms that outlived the people who first shaped them. A brick made to a familiar proportion makes building easier for strangers. A vessel made to a familiar shape fits familiar needs. A shared standard smooths the edges of daily life. It reduces argument. It makes cooperation less fragile. This is where order gains texture. Not the dramatic order of armies or proclamations, but the quiet order of routines, agreements made practical and made physical. The kind of order you can hold in your palm and place on a scale. The kind of order that lets a city breathe without constantly catching its breath. Imagine the shop again, the lamp's circle of light, and two people facing each other across a balance. A buyer stands with a small bundle, grain, perhaps, or a length of cloth, or a piece of worked metal wrapped carefully against the air. The seller draws the bundle onto one side of the scale. For a moment the beam tilts with the simple honesty of gravity. Then the seller reaches to the row of stones and chooses one weight, sets it down. The beam shifts, another, smaller, a pause, another still. The buyer leans in, not with drama but with attention. The seller's hands go still, as if both of them know that too much eagerness spoils trust. They wait for the balance to settle. There is a faint sound when it does, a soft tap, a tiny click of wood or stone finding its rest. And in that moment, something important happens without anyone naming it. The tension eases, the argument ends gently, not because the people have become saints, and not because cheating has been eliminated from the world, but because the decision has been given to a thing that does not care who either of them is. The scale has no family. The weight has no pride. They answer to balance alone. Measurement can seem cold, but in a crowded city it can be merciful. Give strangers a way to cooperate without humiliation. It lets a buyer accept an outcome without feeling defeated. It lets a seller complete an exchange without suspicion, hanging in the air like smoke that won't clear. Somewhere nearby, an apprentice watches. At first, the apprentice thinks precision is only profit, more accurate weights, more accurate outcomes, fewer losses. But day after day, the apprentice begins to see something else. Precision prevents quarrels, it protects reputations, it keeps neighbours speaking. A city can survive many things, but it cannot survive if every exchange becomes a personal war. And the apprentice learns another lesson just as quietly. Trust is fragile. A single, dishonest weight can sour a whole network. Word moves faster than goods. People remember. They cross the street to another shop. They warn a cousin. They tell a neighbour. In that way, a standard may not require an enforcer standing behind every counter. Sometimes it is enforced by consequence, by the silent arithmetic of reputation. Yet systems are never innocent just because they are orderly. A standardized weight can protect the weak from being cheated, yes, but it can also allow powerful networks to expand, to manage bigger flows of goods, to set terms, to control distribution without ever raising a voice. A system that reduces uncertainty can feel like comfort. It can also become a tool. The same scale that cools conflict can, in other hands, quietly decide who gets access and who waits outside the circle of trust. Still, the artifact itself remains what it is. The cubical stone weight set, stable, stackable, consistent, made to be handled. Pick one up and you feel its density. It is not decorative. It is meant to settle disputes without shouting. It is meant to move goods from one set of hands to another with less friction, so the city can keep moving without tearing itself apart. In a way, these little stones are part of the city's invisible architecture. Like drains, they carry away something dangerous, not waste water, but resentment. Like wells, they provide something essential, not water, but a shared sense that agreement is possible, even among strangers. And so, the Indus city continues to write its calm sentence in brick and stone, not only through streets and wells, but through the quiet rituals of exchange. Thousands of people can live close together because countless small acts keep the world from splitting at its seams. As the lamp burns lower, the row of weights returns to stillness. The shop grows quieter. Outside, the night holds the street in its gentle grip. And beyond this market life, beyond the counter, beyond the scale, other marks of identity are waiting. Seals pressed into clay. Small signs that travel without voices. The next chapter will take us there, into writing we cannot yet read. For now, let one question linger in the dimness. soft enough to carry without urgency. When trust can be measured, does it become easier to live together, or easier to control one another? Wet clay receives a seal's press. For a moment it yields like something alive, soft, responsive, willing. The stamp lifts away, and an animal rises from the surface as if it has been called out of the earth. Crisp lines, a steady silhouette, held inside the clay's brief memory. Beneath the animal, a short row of signs appears. Tiny strokes and angles placed with care. They sit there the way frost sits on stone, delicate, exact, and strangely unreachable. In the previous chapter, order lived in weights, objects that helped strangers agree without raising their voices. Now, order takes a different shape, a seal. Across the Indus world, these seals and their clay impressions appear again and again, small enough to fit in a palm, solid enough to travel. When the impressions survive, they tell us something simple and practical. A knot was closed, a bundle was checked, a container was claimed, a transaction was made real. A seal is a quiet kind of authority. It doesn't need to shout. It only needs to be recognized. And still, here is the edge we keep coming to, the place where the story turns softer. The writing that often appears on these seals remains undeciphered. The signs are there, consistent enough to prove they mattered, but they refuse to open into sentences. We cannot read names, titles, rules, prayers, contracts, or stories the way we can elsewhere in the ancient world. We cannot follow an argument from start to finish. We cannot hear a voice step forward and say, plainly, "This is who I am." So we move carefully. We do not pretend to know what these signs say. We do not force a language into them. We treat them the way you treat a door that will not open. You note the hinges, the worn threshold, the marks around the frame. You learn what you can from the way it was used. Scholars have offered possibilities, reasonable ones, ownership marks, administrative labels, proof that a bundle hasn't been opened, signs of affiliation, household, workshop, status, profession. Any of these could be true in some combination, but without reading, certainty stays out of reach. What we can say is that these objects were meant for use. They show wear that suggests handling. They appear in contexts that suggest exchange and management. They're carved carefully enough to leave clean impressions, repeatable, unmistakable. The inscriptions are usually short, and that shortness matters. It hints at tags, identifiers, the kind of writing that keeps a system running rather than the kind that tells a story. And it's possible, quietly possible, that the most important writing in daily life was exactly that, the ordinary label. The little line of signs that made things move smoothly through a crowded world. There is something humbling in that thought, because if the writing was often practical, then what we have lost may not be epics. It may be something smaller, names repeated across transactions, counts, marks of responsibility. The plain bookkeeping of a civilization, rarely remembered, yet essential while it lasts. To feel the world these seals served, imagine dusk in a storeroom or at the edge of a market when the light begins to thin. A clerk seals a bundle at the end of the day. The air smells of dust and fibre, and something faintly sharp like oil or resin rubbed into cord. The bundle lies on a low surface, wrapped and tied. The clerk kneads a small lump of clay until it softens, then presses it onto the knot. The cord leaves fine lines in the wet surface, like a quick signature. Then the seal comes down. Not hard, just firm enough. Even pressure. No hesitation. When the stamp lifts, the impression is clean. The animal appears. The signs sit beneath it. The bundle is no longer simply tied. It is verified. It carries a portable trace of identity, something another person in another place can recognize without knowing the face behind it. And the future of this one transaction depends on that small, neat mark. Not the future of the entire civilization, perhaps, but the future of whether the goods will be accepted without dispute, whether someone will be accused of tampering, whether trust will survive the distance between departure and arrival. The seal stands in for a person's presence when the person cannot be there. That is a quiet achievement, identity made portable. And before the seal ever touches clay, there is the hand that made it. A seal carver sits with the raw material, stone that will become a tool of recognition. The carver steadies the breath, then cuts a line that cannot be uncut. This work is restraint as much as skill. The animal must be balanced. The signs must be sharp enough to print clearly, small enough to fit, clean enough to avoid confusion. A single slip could ruin the seal, or worse, create a mark that looks almost right and causes doubt later. The carver works slowly, listening to the faint scrape of tool against stone. It is a quiet sound, but it carries discipline inside it. Patience turned into precision. And because we cannot read what was carved, the act can feel almost ceremonial, not because we know the meaning, but because we know the meaning mattered to someone. Enough to be cut into stone, enough to be trusted. A stamp seal and a surviving clay sealing. Together they are proof of systems moving through daily life. The sealing is especially moving because it is not the object itself, but the trace it left behind. Evidence of an action. Someone pressed, someone verified, someone accepted. In the Indus world, so often, we meet the civilization through gestures rather than speeches. We can imagine the seals travelling through the city's networks. A bundle leaves a workshop and arrives at a storehouse. Another goes downriver. Another is carried by cart toward a staging town where routes converge. At each threshold, the impression can be checked. The mark stands between inside and outside, between what is known and what is uncertain. Weights measure goods, seals measure identity. Together they make exchange less fragile. They make a world of strangers more livable. They let trust travel. And yet, underneath all this practical brilliance, the ache remains. If we could read the signs, what would we meet? A king, a council, a merchant house, a workshop mark passed from hand to hand, or something even simpler, a person's name, repeated so often it became ordinary, belonging to someone who never imagined being searched for thousands of years later. We do not know, and we let that not knowing stay in the room. Because the Indus world, for all its coordination, refuses to speak to us in full sentences. It offers marks, patterns, systems, traces. It asks us to listen in a different way. And as we move forward, beyond seals and storerooms, toward courtyards and hearths, toward food and cloth and sleep, let one quiet question drift with us, like warmth leaving brick at dusk. If we could finally read one short seal, would it reveal a ruler, a trader, a workshop, or simply a human name? Pre-dawn rests in a courtyard, that in-between hour when a city seems to pause on purpose. The sky is still dark, but its edge has begun to loosen, as if the night is letting go a little at a time. Cool air settles low, holding onto the brick and the packed earth. Somewhere beyond the walls a dog shifts, then decides the world is quiet enough to sleep again. In the courtyard, a grindstone murmurs, stone against stone, an unhurried sound that belongs to mornings before talk. A pot warms near a small, careful fire, and someone moves with the slow precision of habit, stepping around the sleepers as if the floor itself is a promise not to disturb. In the last chapter, we lingered with seals, identity pressed into clay, trust made portable, systems that could travel without a voice. Now we move inward, away from counters and storerooms, away from official marks and measured exchange, and into the place where most life actually happens, inside the home. Because no city, no matter how straight its streets, how clever its drains, can survive on infrastructure alone. It survives on domestic rhythm, on grain ground before dawn, on water lifted and carried, on cloth made into warmth, on the quiet work of keeping bodies fed, washed, and rested. Work that rarely leaves a monument behind, yet holds the whole structure of the city in place, like unseen beams under a roof. Much of what we know about daily life in the Indus world comes to us through these ordinary traces. Household tools worn by use, charred seeds caught in ash, pottery broken and swept into corners, the repeated logic of rooms and courtyards that suggests how people move through their days. This is not history preserved in speeches. It is history preserved in touch, objects shaped by hands until they fit the hand back again. And here, water appears not as a distant resource, but as something pulled close to life. In many Indus homes, access to water was structured and near, often through wells, and shaped the smallest decisions: how a pot was rinsed, how a floor was kept, how quickly a meal could be prepared, how easily a child could be cleaned after playing in dust. Drainage, too, belonged to the household in a practical, almost private way. Waste was guided away. The home was not meant to sit in its own refuse. Cleanliness did not have to wait for a special moment. It could be folded into the day like any other habit. That does not mean every home was the same. It does not mean everyone lived with the same ease. Some houses were larger, more complex, more durable in their construction, and they held more goods. Wealth varied, status varied. The exact shape of hierarchy, how sharply society was divided, how authority was expressed, remains something scholars handle with care, because the familiar signs of obvious elite display are not as clear here as they are in some other ancient worlds. But whatever a family's means, the same tasks returned steady as the tide, grinding, cooking, spinning, weaving, cleaning, fetching water, tending fire. These were the constant engines beneath public life. Without them, markets do not function, workshops do not produce, and streets lose their meaning. A city is held up by the labour that happens before dawn, again after dusk, and again at midday when heat presses down and even breathing feels like work. It is easy, standing among ruins, to forget that. Walls are what remain. Drains are what remain. Streets are what remain. But what made those structures into a living city was mostly routine, unrecorded, unpraised, repeated until it became the shape of safety. Perhaps a city's true monument is not a tower, but a sequence. Water, fire, food, cloth, rest. In the courtyard, that sequence begins with the grindstone. Someone leans in with practiced weight. Grain is poured in a measured handful, not from a written recipe, but from a memory that lives in the wrists and shoulders. The motion is steady, almost quiet enough to become thought. The stone resists at first, then yields its sound as the grain breaks down, turning from hard kernels into what the body can live on. Nearby, the pot warms. The fire is small and controlled. It does not roar. It keeps its strength close. Fuel is too valuable to waste. Heat is treated like water, something you make last. The pot's surface grows warm to the touch. A faint smell rises. Grain, perhaps, or milk, or something simmering slowly enough to keep its taste. A child sleeps on the far side of the courtyard, curled beneath a light covering. Even in a climate that can be harsh in daylight, night coolness can ask for warmth. Someone steps around that sleeping body with the quiet attentiveness of experience. This too is work, not heavy work, not public work, just the daily discipline of care. And as the morning edges closer, another industry continues, one that rarely survives in the ground, though it once surrounded every life. By lamplight, fibre is spun. The lamp is small, its flame protected from drafts, throwing a soft circle of light onto hands and thread. The spindle turns with patient consistency, drawing something loose and fragile into something strong enough to hold. Fibre becomes yarn. Yarn becomes the possibility of cloth, something that can be worn, carried, traded, stored. Something that turns wind and cold into a softer problem. The act itself is not dramatic. It is repetitive, but repetition is how a city stays human. Cloth is everywhere in life, and yet cloth vanishes so easily in time. What remains for us often is the tool, the spindle whirl, small and weighted, designed to keep the spin steady, to keep the thread even, to keep the work from unraveling. In the same household, a parent measures a child's growing strength by small permissions, not ceremonies, just quiet thresholds. The first time a child carries water alone and brings most of it home. The first time a child is trusted near a safe flame. The first time a child learns to place a pot down without cracking it. These moments do not call for speeches, but they change the balance of the household. They are the slow transfer of responsibility, and responsibility is one of the quiet foundations of settled life. Water becomes a teacher early. A child learns the weight of a filled vessel, and the body's instinctive adjustments to keep it steady. Learns how to walk without sloshing too much, without wasting what was drawn with effort. Even in a city of wells, water is not thoughtless. It is near, yes, but still precious enough to be handled with attention. Food teaches too. Grain teaches patience. It must be ground, cooked, portioned, saved. Meals teach timing. Fires need watchfulness. Pots need listening. Heat needs restraint. Cooking teaches planning without writing. What is eaten now? What is saved for later? What is shared? What is kept back for the long stretch between seasons when the world asks for carefulness? The household is a school, and its lessons are absorbed through doing. If we want an artifact to carry this chapter's meaning, it is not a crown or a weapon. It is the worn grindstone and the spindle whirl, objects shaped by hands until they become smooth, almost gentle. A grindstone begins rough. Over years of use, it is polished by repetition. Its surface changed by the simple insistence of daily need. The spindle whirl is easy to overlook, yet it represents hours made visible. Thread drawn out of fibre, cloth drawn out of thread, warmth drawn out of work. When you imagine a city, it is tempting to picture its public face. Streets, drains, markets, seals. But the Indus city also had this inward face. Courtyards and hearths, jars of grain, lamps that held back darkness, hands turning fibre into clothing, bodies settling into sleep. Perhaps this is where the city was most truly felt, because safety is not only the absence of danger, safety is the presence of routine. The knowledge that tomorrow will resemble today in reliable ways, the sense that the water will be close, grain will be stored, and a roof will hold back the night. We cannot know the lullabies. We cannot read private thoughts. The Indus world does not give us that kind of voice. But the material evidence suggests something still intimate. Comfort and order were not accidents. They were built, maintained, repeated, until they became what normal meant, and as the city wakes, slowly, without haste, the household completes its early tasks. Food is prepared, water is ready. Cloth continues to be made, one thread at a time. The sleepers begin to stir. Outside, the street waits. The day will carry people into workshops and markets again, into the wider systems of trade and identity. But the home remains the first foundation, and as we prepare to step outward again, toward workshops, toward the long reach of Indus goods, let one quiet question remain in the air, as soft as the last moments before dawn. What did safety feel like at night, under a flat roof beside stored grain with water close enough to touch. Heat lives inside a kiln the way a heartbeat lives inside a body, steady, contained, never quite at rest. Close to the mouth of the fire, the air trembles. In the workshop's dimness, small stones catch and return the light. Carnelian beads, warming toward amber and red, like dusk held in the palm. They lie in a shallow tray beside powdery grit and fine dust, and you can tell at a glance that nothing here was made quickly. Everything here has been persuaded into shape. In the last chapter, we stayed inside the home, where safety was measured in water within reach and grain stored close. Now we step outward, into the places that made the city more than a place to live. Because the Indus world did not only build streets and wells, it built objects that could leave the city cross-distance and arrive as proof that skill existed here. Quietly, consistently, without spectacle. Archaeology shows the presence of specialized work at multiple Indus sites: bead-making, shell-working, pottery, production and metalworking, among other crafts. The evidence is not always the finished object. Often it's the workshop's afterlife, drill bits and abrasives, half-finished pieces, heaps of sherds, ash and slag, the scattered remains of repeated labour. A workshop is a place where order and mess coexist. The mess is not careless. It is simply the honest residue of making, and behind that residue is discipline. A craftsperson learns to see the future inside raw material. A shell is not just something washed up from a coast. It is a bangle waiting for the right cut. A lump of copper is not a dull mass. It is a tool, an edge, a fitting, something that can endure friction and time. A bead blank is not yet beauty. It is risk, because stone can split and hours can disappear into a single mistake. That is why specialization matters. Practice makes outcomes more predictable, and in a world built on exchange, predictability becomes a kind of trust. It lets people plan. It lets roots grow familiar. It lets strangers agree that what they are trading for will be what it claims to be. Indus materials and goods moved widely, along inland roads and rivers, and through connections that reached coasts and travelled by water. Some of that movement was slow and creaking. Carts and pack animals crossing plains, drivers navigating mud after rain and dust after heat. Some of it was smoother and quieter, bundles transferred to boats, cargo tucked into hulls, shoreline stitched together by repeated trips. The Indus was never a sealed pocket of the world. It belonged to larger networks, connected by people who knew how to travel and how to make travel worth the risk. We have to be modest about what the evidence can't directly give us. We do not have shipping lists to read. We do not open a merchant's diary and watch a deal unfold in ink. But when Indus-style objects appear beyond the civilization's core regions, and when distant materials appear inside Indus cities, the pattern is hard to ignore. Distance was being crossed often enough to leave a trace. How that trade was organized is still debated. It may have been household scale in many places, families producing surplus and trading through local contacts. In larger centers, it may have included clustered workshop groups producing in greater volume. Some scholars argue that certain flows of goods suggest coordination by institutions or civic systems, at least in some contexts. It may also have been all of these at once, shifting from region to region and changing over time. The Indus world was not a single machine with one switch. It was a broad landscape of habits. Whatever the mechanism, movement required logistics. A city needs grain and fuel, raw stone and shell, metal and clay, wood and fibre. It needs the steady arrival of what it cannot produce in its own courtyards. And to sustain that steadiness, routes need nodes, stopping places where water can be found, animals can rest, bundles can be checked, small repairs made, news exchanged. These staging towns are easy to miss in the romance of long-distance trade, but they are where trade becomes possible. They are the knots in the net. Imagine a morning road, still cool before the day turns harsh. A cart leans into its harness and complains softly as it moves. The wheels follow grooves worn by many earlier wheels. The driver knows the small betrayals of the route, where the ground turns slick after rain, where sand shifts under load, where a shallow rise steals strength from animals. Along the way, there are places that feel almost like promises: wells, river bends, open yards where travellers are not treated as threats, where an exchange can be made without tension. These are not only physical necessities, they are social agreements. A route survives on the quiet expectation that the next place will still be there, and inside that expectation, objects travel. If something travels far enough, it stops being only a possession and begins to behave like a message. A bead worn on a distant wrist says a connection exists. It says a road was crossed. It says someone trusted a stranger, and the trust held long enough for the object to arrive intact. It says taste has learned to move. Return then to the workshop and its steady fire. A bead maker works with carnelian, chosen for its colour and the way it holds light. The process is slow by necessity. Heat can deepen the stone's tones, but heat can also ruin it. Too fast and a hairline crack forms like a secret. Too uneven, and the weakness is born inside where no one can see it, until the day it breaks. The bead is warmed, cooled, and warmed again. Watch the way you watch anything that can fail quietly. Then it is polished, patiently, with abrasives that turn roughness into sheen. The surface becomes smooth enough to catch the lamp's glow and return it. After that comes drilling, a steady tool, a fine abrasive grit, a hole made not by force but by insistence. Minutes stretch, the hole deepens, the bead becomes not just shaped but usable, ready to be strung, worn, carried. When the bead is finished, the maker lifts it toward the light and turns it slowly. Not for admiration, not yet, first for judgment. The maker is looking for what others might miss. A faint internal fracture, a flaw disguised by shine. A bead can look perfect and still be doomed. Experience teaches the eye to see through beauty. Only then does the bead leave the workshop, and when it leaves, it enters a world that is less about fire and dust and more about people. At a dock or a river staging point, a trader learns that manners can be as valuable as metal. A pause at the right moment. The patience to listen more than speak. A gesture offered without pushing for a return. Trade is not only roads and boats. It is the careful management of misunderstanding. It is learning how respect is shown in another place, and how easily a small mistake can harden into distrust. Every return journey brings more than goods back into the city. It brings information. Which route has become unsafe? What a distant community now wants? What has become scarce? What has become abundant? What style is admired? What symbol is recognized? A city's horizon expands not only with geography, but with knowledge. This is why small artifacts can matter so much. A finished carnelian bead, a shell bangle, portable luxuries that travel well and justify the cost of distance. Shell often hints at coastal connections, even when found far inland. Carnelian can point to specific sources and production traditions, as well as the expertise needed to turn stone into something that holds light. When such objects appear across sites, they do more than decorate the past. They map invisible routes, and what is striking is how calm this reach can be. It does not require conquest to travel. It requires reliability. It requires repeatable methods and shared expectations. It requires the order we've been tracing. Streets that make movement easy, measures that make exchange less tense, seals that make identity portable, households that make labour possible, workshops that transform raw material into something desired. And yet, even in all this movement, there are silences that remain. We still cannot read the signs, we still cannot call the names. We do not know what stories were told when work ended and the city cooled into night. Perhaps those stories travelled too, carried softly with goods and gossip, changing shape at each stopping place. Perhaps they stayed rooted in courtyards, passed down where no stranger could hear them. We cannot say. But we can feel what trade does to a world. It widens it. The city becomes more than brick and water. It becomes a maker of messages, objects that leave home and begin a second life. A bead is worn. It is admired. It is exchanged again. It warms against a body that has never seen the kiln that made it. And still, in its shine, it carries the quiet discipline of the hands that shaped it. And as we move into the next chapter, toward meaning without a book, toward symbols, cleanliness, and the sacred as habit, let this image stay with us. Something small that crossed distance without speaking and still arrived understood. So let one question remain, gentle enough to follow like a soft footstep in the dark. When a bead made in one city is worn in another, whose story does it belong to? The makers or the wearers? Still water holds a square of night sky the way a dark mirror holds a face, faithfully but never perfectly. The stars shiver in the reflection, not because the heavens are restless, but because water is always making small decisions. A breath of wind, a distant footstep, a quiet ripple that refuses to stay still. Nearby, brick catches the sound of someone moving through a lane. 2 or 3 soft impacts, then nothing. The echoes slide around corners, thinning into courtyards, until the city feels briefly emptied of intention. It is an odd sensation, standing in a place made for thousands and hearing only a handful of steps, as if the whole city has paused to listen to itself. In the last chapter, objects travelled. Beads and bangles crossed roads and river paths, and sometimes reached the edge of the sea, carrying messages without speech. Now we turn to a different kind of message, one that may not have gone far in distance but went deep in repetition, meaning. And here the Indus world asks for patience because it does not leave behind what other ancient places so often do. There is no confirmed sacred book we can open, no hymn we can quote, no carved dedication we can read aloud and say, with confidence, this is what they believed, this is how they named the unseen. Whatever prayers may have been spoken, they did not survive in sentences we can recover. So we do what we have been doing all along. We listen to what repeats. We watch how a city teaches the body to move. We pay attention to the quiet architecture of behaviour, the small habits that shape a life until they feel inevitable. Across the Indus world, certain images return again and again. On seals and small objects, on figurines shaped by hand, animals appear with a steadiness that suggests recognition, forms chosen, repeated, remembered. In a civilization that left us so few readable words, these repetitions matter. A symbol is only a symbol if someone else understands it. Even when we cannot, they could. But recognition is not the same as certainty. An image that looks sacred to us may have been an emblem of a guild, a household, a place, a story told to children, or simply something pleasing enough to repeat. Meaning can be layered, and it can shift. One motif can belong to many purposes at once. The evidence allows us to feel significance without forcing it into a single modern label. If we imagine a seal pressed into wet clay, an animal lifted cleanly from the surface, a short line of signs beneath it, we are looking at a world that knew how to mark identity, how to verify exchange, how to make trust portable. That same world may also have used images for protection, affiliation, or memory. We do not have to decide too quickly. The Indus does not reward impatience. And then there is water, everywhere in the built life of these cities, present not only as necessity, but as a kind of discipline. Wells appear in numbers that make water feel close. Drains carry away what must be carried away. Cleanliness is not left entirely to chance. In at least some places, large bathing areas were built with a seriousness that feels deliberate, spaces that required planning, construction, sealing, upkeep. Their exact purpose is debated, and we should keep it that way in our minds, civic, ritual, or both, shifting over time, changing with context. What matters is the choice the city made, to treat water as something that belonged to order. And monumental here does not mean a tower piercing the sky or a king's face carved larger than life. It means restraint. It means brick fitted tightly enough to hold water where water would rather escape. It means steps laid carefully enough that bodies can descend without hurry. It means a space designed to slow the pace of a person's day. To feel what that might have meant, imagine dusk settling into one of these bathing spaces. The light above is fading, thinning into softer blues and greys, but down here the brick still holds the day's heat. The air is warmer, gentler. The surface of the water is cool and waiting, reflecting what remains of the sky. Someone descends slowly, one step, then another. Each foot meets the water with a small, controlled ripple. Above, the city continues, voices behind walls, smoke from cooking fires, distant movement. But here the sounds arrive muffled, as if the space has been built to let the world become quieter. The descent itself becomes part of the act. The shift in temperature, the change in echo, the way the body notices its own weight and its own skin. Dust and sweat, the day's evidence, meet water and begin to loosen. Whether this was ceremony, hygiene, civic routine, or something that blended all three, it is hard to imagine it as meaningless. It asks for attention, and attention is often where meaning lives. If belief was not written down, it may have been practiced instead, spread through ordinary actions until it became part of what felt. Right? Perhaps that is why household life matters so much when we think about the Indus. Not because homes always carry the official face of a culture, but because homes are where habits become inheritance. Picture a small courtyard at night. A lamp is low. The last heat of the day has begun to leave the bricks. A child, half asleep, learns a gesture that is never announced as sacred and never explained as doctrine. Maybe it is washing hands before lying down. Maybe it is rinsing dust from feet at the threshold. Maybe it is a quiet touch to a doorway, or the careful placement of a small object in a corner. We do not know the exact shape of it, and we will not pretend to, but we can understand the structure. The child learns by watching, by being corrected gently once or twice, by repeating the act until it no longer feels like instruction and begins to feel like how night begins. Years later, that child, grown, tired, busy, will do the same gesture without thinking, and someone smaller will watch and learn. Meaning moves through bodies like that, even in societies with libraries. It is carried in the muscles, in timing, in the quiet decision to do something the way it has always been done. And in the Indus world, small objects hover at the edges of this question like clues we can hold but not fully open. Terracotta figurines shaped by hand. Seal motifs repeated across distance. A figurine might be a toy, a symbol, an offering, a household presence with more than one purpose. A seal image might be identity, authority, protection, affiliation, or simply a trusted mark in a world of exchange. The fact of their repetition tells us they mattered. The uncertainty of their meaning tells us we're listening from far away. That veil is not a failure of the story. It is part of its atmosphere. Because this civilization gives us so much evidence of how people lived, how they planned streets, how they kept water close, how they measured, how they made, how they traded. And yet when we reach for the inner voice, the explicit statement of belief, we find ourselves holding quiet instead. But quiet is not emptiness. Quiet can be filled with pattern. A city that invests in drains and wells is investing in cleanliness as a value, not merely a convenience. A society that repeats symbols is investing in shared recognition, the sense that some images belong to many eyes at once. A culture that builds and maintains bathing spaces is shaping the body's relationship to order. These things do not hand us theology, they hand us priorities. And priorities sometimes are the most honest traces a civilization leaves behind. So we return to the still water reflecting the square of night sky. We let the stars tremble in it, without demanding that they spell a sentence. We let meaning be distributed, not concentrated in one towering temple, but spread through thresholds and habits, not proclaimed in long inscriptions, but suggested in repeated images, not shouted but practiced. And then, inevitably, time begins to change the city. In the next chapter, the streets will grow quieter, the great centers will thin out, life will shift shape, sometimes slowly, sometimes unevenly, depending on the region and the river and the rain. The systems will not vanish all at once. They will loosen and transform as living things do. So let one quiet question drift with us now, as footsteps fade on brick, and the water returns to stillness. If belief was lived more than spoken, what parts of it could survive after the streets and the voices are gone? A quieter street lies under a pale sky. The light has a washed, careful quality, as if the day is learning restraint. The brick is still there, straight lines holding to old decisions, but the street no longer feels crowded with the steady traffic of ordinary confidence. Fewer footsteps, less cooking smoke threading upward from every roof. The silence is not emptiness, it is spacing. Life still moves, just with more air between its movements, like a melody played a little softer each season, until no one can name the moment it changed. In the last chapter, we stood beside still water and tried to sense meaning without a book. Belief lived through habit, symbols repeated until they became familiar as doorways, cleanliness woven into daily order. Now the story turns, not with a single dramatic break, but with a slow shift of weight, the kind of change you only notice after it has already taken hold. After the mature Harappan phase, many of the great urban centres begin to shrink, change character, or, in some places, fall quiet altogether. Across wide stretches of the Indus world, settlement patterns tilt towards smaller communities. The dense urban rhythm loosens. Streets that once belonged to thousands begin to belong to fewer. The same landscape remains, but the way people inhabit it becomes less concentrated, more dispersed, life reorganizing itself rather than vanishing. It helps to let this be what it appears to be in the ground. Transformation, not a clean ending. The earth doesn't show a civilization snapping off like a branch. It shows a civilization adjusting its shape. Why that adjustment happened is still debated, and the evidence asks for humility. Many scholars point to environmental pressures as part of the story. Shifts in monsoon behavior, stretches of drier conditions, rivers that change course or become less dependable. None of these forces need to arrive as a single catastrophe to matter. A slight change in rainfall timing can undo an old certainty. A river that once came faithfully can begin to hesitate. A floodplain can grow less generous or less predictable. Farming becomes harder to plan. Transport routes that depend on reliable water become less dependable. And when the quiet supports of daily life become uncertain, people respond in the ways people always have. Some adapt where they are, Some move, some reorganize how they live. The material world reflects this change in small, steady ways. Pottery styles evolve, site layouts shift, populations gather in new places and thin out in others. Archaeologists see it in layers, a floor built and used, then later used again in a simpler way. A neighborhood that changes its density, a site that holds occupation in one form, then in another. The story, in other words, is not only written in abandonment, it is written in reuse. And that detail matters because it points to something basic and easily forgotten in sweeping narratives. People continue. They do not dissolve into the ground. They make choices. They carry skills with them. They adjust their routines and expectations, sometimes under pressure, sometimes by preference, sometimes because the old pattern simply stops fitting. Most likely, more than one force overlapped. Environmental stress in some areas, shifts in trade and movement in others, and local social changes that we can sense only indirectly. If roots reorient, a city that once prospered as a node can lose its advantage without any violence needing to occur. If agricultural reliability fades, it becomes harder to support large concentrations of people, and smaller communities can feel like the safer shape. If institutions, whatever form they took, become less able or less necessary to sustain wide standardization, practices that once stretched across regions can become more local, more varied, more rooted in place. The Indus world was vast, and its transformation was not uniform. Some areas may have held to older patterns longer, others may have shifted earlier. The evidence gives us rhythms and tendencies rather than a single tidy storyline. It gives us complexity with soft edges. Civilizations do not always collapse like a wall. Sometimes they change the way salt changes water, still present, just no longer held in the same form. The city's systems, standards, drains, wells, routines, do not necessarily shatter. They thin, they scatter. They become less widely shared, more local in their expression. What once felt like one calm sentence written across a great distance begins to break into shorter phrases, regional, practical, adaptive. To feel the change in human terms, imagine a household at the edge of departure. Inside a room that has known many seasons, a family chooses what to carry. The air is quieter than usual, as if the walls have learned to listen. On the floor, a few objects are gathered with care. A cooking pot blackened by years of fire, so familiar it feels almost like part of the family's hand. A simple tool, useful, durable, not easily replaced. A bundle of cloth tied around small necessities. Around them, heavier things remain. Large storage jars, fixed furnishings, the weight of brick itself. Things that were meant to stay. Leaving them behind is strange, not only because of their value, but because they hold memory. A storage jar remembers seasons of grain poured in and poured out. A hearth remembers early mornings and late meals. A doorway remembers who passed through it in joy and in worry. But memory has weight, and movement demands selection. The family's hands hesitate, not because they do not understand practicality, but because practicality is never only practical. They do not say goodbye with ceremony. They do it through quiet choices. This goes, that stays. Outside in the open air, a farmer watches the sky with a different kind of attention. For years, seasons have been patterns. When to plant, when to wait, when to trust the rain's return. But now the old timing no longer feels faithful. The rain arrives differently, or not at all. Heat holds on longer. The river's behaviour shifts. Knowledge that once worked like an inheritance begins to fail, and the failure is not dramatic. It is subtle. It is the slow recognition that the world has changed its habits. Adaptation becomes its own kind of courage. Not the courage of battle, but the courage of revision. The courage of trying a new timing, a different field, a different crop. The courage of moving a life that was built for staying. Large historical shifts are made of these small acts, repeated across many households, people adjusting to a world that no longer matches their old expectations, and the ground keeps the trace of that truth. A later household pot suggests continued domestic life, cooking, eating, storing, enduring. A reoccupied floor layer suggests that spaces were not simply abandoned and forgotten. They were used again, differently, simplified, shifted, persisting in another form. In this transformed era, the city is not empty everywhere, but it is different. The density thins, the wide coordination loosens, the shared standards that once made the Indus world feel remarkably consistent across distance become less uniform, more regional, more varied, more tuned to local needs. Yet even as the shape changes, something remains recognizable: the human commitment to daily life. People still grind grain at dawn, they still carry water, they still keep fires and cook meals, they still make choices about cleanliness, about order, about what to keep and what to let go. They still form communities, even if those communities are smaller, scattered, less urban in form. It can be tempting to call this decline, but that word can be harsher than the evidence requires. What we can see, more clearly than any single label, is change. Sometimes pressured, sometimes adaptive, sometimes uneven. A reshaping of life to match a reshaping world. And as the street grows quieter under the pale sky, we can imagine the city not ending with a crash, but easing back into the landscape as footprints soften under wind and silt. Brick remains, wells remain, drains remain. But the dense web of people that once animated them loosens. The next time someone walks the straight street, the echoes may be fewer, the lamplit shops may be fewer, the hands that lift drain covers after rain may return less often, and somewhere nearby, perhaps in a smaller settlement, perhaps in a relocated household, a grindstone still whispers at dawn, a pot still warms, a spindle still turns. Life continues, simply shaped differently. And as we move toward the final epilogue, toward lantern light in excavation trenches, toward brick edges returning from earth, let one last question from this chapter stay with us, tender and human. If you had to leave a city you loved, what would you carry so your children could still remember who they are? A lantern flickers in an excavation trench. Its flame leans, then steadies again, responding to the smallest breath of night air. Around it, the earth has been cut back with care, step after step, layer after layer, each band of soil holding a slightly different shade of time. And there, where the lantern's circle of light falls brightest, the edge of a brick line appears, not rubble, not chaos, a corner, a straight run, a familiar proportion. The bricks do not announce themselves, and yet they feel unmistakable, like a thought returning after a long silence. For centuries they have waited under silt and dust, not preserved by intention, but by chance and earth and forgetting. Now they re-enter the world slowly, one careful scrape at a time. Modern excavation has revealed the vastness of this civilization, and the work continues, refining timelines, mapping regional variety, and recovering the texture of ordinary life with patience rather than spectacle. The story we've followed was not found in a single dramatic discovery. It was assembled the way the trenches opened, measured, cautious, cumulative, sites mapped, layers compared, pottery sequences traced, seeds and bones studied, workshop debris examined, shared standards noticed again and again across distance. Knowledge returns here the way dawn returns, without fanfare. A line of brick, then another. A drain cover stone, a well shaft, a scatter of beads, A sherd with a familiar curve, a seal, small enough to disappear in a pocket. The Indus does not come back like a voice. It comes back like a pattern, systems resurfacing in fragments, still coherent enough to be recognized. What survives most clearly is material life. Streets and houses, wells and drains, workshops and trade goods. The quiet insistence of standardized ways of building and measuring. Even now, those choices remain legible. Water held close, waste guided away, movement made predictable, exchange made verifiable, skill repeated until it becomes dependable. These are not monuments to one person's glory. They are traces of coordinated living, decisions made again and again for the sake of the many. And still, the script waits. The signs remain, sharp and deliberate but unread. Names do not arrive to meet us. Titles, if they were written, do not unfold into meaning. We cannot open a prayer or a contract or a letter and hear a human voice cross the centuries intact. We can point to the symbols. We can track their repetition. We can sense their purpose. But the door they represent stays closed. That silence changes the shape of our awe. It shifts attention away from famous individuals and towards something harder to romanticize, but perhaps more enduring, the dignity of systems that served ordinary people. In the trench, a researcher kneels close to the soil. The tools are small, the movements are controlled, each scrape is an act of restraint, a refusal to hurry the past into the present. Then something appears, too crisp to be a random stone, too intentional to be accident. A small seal lifted carefully from the earth. It is still coated in dirt at first, the details blurred. A brush clears it gently. The surface sharpens. An animal figure begins to emerge, contained, balanced, confident. Beneath it, the tiny signs reveal themselves, lines and strokes arranged with intention, as clean as if they were carved yesterday rather than thousands of years ago. In that moment, the researcher holds something intimate. Not a crown, not a monument. A tool of identity, once pressed into clay by a hand we will never know, used to close a bundle, to mark a transaction, to make a stranger trust what could not be seen. And the realization can feel almost unsettling in its simplicity. Civilization can fade, and still its smallest mark of belonging can remain. Later, in a museum, a seal like this may rest behind glass. It is small enough to fit in a palm, yet time has made it heavy. The animal still holds its quiet gaze. The signs still refuse us. It becomes a reminder that history can be richly present even when it will not speak in sentences. We're used to thinking of the past as something narrated. Chronicles, names, proclamations, loud certainty. But here the past comes to us through streets under earth, through drain channels and well linings, through weights worn by handling, through beads polished to catch light, through spindle whirls smoothed by countless hours, through a seal that once sat at the threshold between trust and suspicion. The Indus remains a civilization we can feel more than we can quote, and perhaps that fits the hour. In late-night listening, when the lights are low and the mind grows gentle, certainty is less seductive than presence. The Indus offers presence. People who built for daily life, who treated water and cleanliness and fairness as practical priorities, who practiced craft with patience, who trusted systems enough to repeat them across great distances and long time. The lantern continues to flicker. The trench settles into quiet again. The brick edges do not demand anything from us. They simply hold their line, calm and uncompromising, as if the old city is still thinking in straight streets beneath the dark. And if we let that calm remain with us, it leaves a final question. Not urgent, not loud, but persistent, like a familiar sound heard just before sleep. When our own cities become ruins, will we be remembered by our loudest stories, or by the quiet things we built to care for daily life.